Hi guys! So this is actually my second time making this video because I made a mistake the first time, but it's probably a good thing because the first time around it turned out really long. So I'm hoping this time, now that I've said everything that I kind of plan to say, that I can be a little bit more succinct the second time around. So I'm going to talk about something a little bit different this week. Normally when I talk about spiritual practice, I really focus on pantheism, and specifically pantheism in relation to paganism. And it's been a long time since I've talked about any other forms of pagan or witch practices on the channel, and particularly about Wicca. I definitely made a video a few years back as part of the Facebook pagan YouTube challenge, or whatever it was called, where I talked about the first book that I had ever read as a pagan, and I think that I maybe made another video as well about how I started out as a pagan. And essentially when I first encountered paganism and witchcraft, I was a sort of eclectic Wiccan for the first kind of 3 years, so from ages about 15 to 18. I roughly considered myself to be an eclectic Wiccan, and it wasn't until I came back to my practice in my kind of early to mid-20s that I really started to let go of that label. So when I came back to my spiritual practice when I was about 22 or 23, the main question that I was really trying to ask myself initially was essentially if I could believe in divinity the way that I had as a Wiccan and the way that I thought that other Wiccans and other pagans did, and if I could believe in magic, because to my mind it definitely didn't make any sense to me to be Christian, and it didn't really make sense to me to go looking for other religions either. Wicca and paganism, but Wicca specifically, was my foundation in religion and spirituality. It was the religion that made sense to me. And the big question that I really had to ask myself in order to see if I could actually be spiritual or religious, I thought at the time, was, you know, basically, can I be Wiccan? And so I delved back into the books that I had read, I delved back into the old online material, and I found new stuff and new people to follow. And I found it all really fascinating. I've always been really drawn to that system, but increasingly over time I came to the conclusion that no, I actually couldn't be Wiccan. But at the same time I was finding new ways that I could actually be spiritual without necessarily having those kinds of beliefs, without necessarily believing in personified deity of any kind, without necessarily believing in magic, and so on. And so over time I gradually transitioned from an initial practice that still looked quite Wiccan. I was still casting a circle and calling the quarters, but I gradually started to let go of various different elements until I got to the point that I basically am at today, where my practice kind of doesn't look Wiccan at all. I would say the least Wiccan my practice has ever been was back when I was still in Edinburgh, when I was absolutely no longer casting any kind of circle, I wasn't calling any kind of quarters, I wasn't working with any kind of elements, and my idea of divinity was super metaphoric, still in a binary system. But in the binary system of creation and destruction, roughly using kind of feminine pronouns, so like roughly feminine divinity, but essentially just a very kind of scientific pantheistic kind of understanding of the world. But I did let go of all those Wiccan elements very gradually, and there's nothing necessarily stopping me from bringing them back in, and I definitely have brought some of them back in, and I have played around with them over time. And the first thing that went for me was the goddess and god, though, and I still think that this is probably, well, it's one of two main reasons that I'm not Wiccan. And basically it became more and more difficult for me to justify splitting divinity into the binary system of god and goddess, and seeing divinity as being inherently masculine on one hand, on one side, and feminine on the other. I spent a long time, even back in my teenage years, really trying to understand this and unravel it and make it make sense for me. I spent a lot of time the first kind of couple of years that I came to Wicca or paganism. I spent a lot of time building up an understanding of what the goddess and god were supposed to be, and I found that very exciting. The metaphors really worked for me. I loved the imagery. I loved the association with various different parts of nature. It worked so well for me on an emotional level, but the more that I started thinking about it on a more cerebral level, the less it made sense to me outside of myself and outside of other humans and other animals. It kind of made sense on a kind of earth-based level, I suppose, to think about nature in a kind of feminine and masculine kind of way, because of the way that a lot of animals reproduce, that, you know, they are actually split into feminine and masculine. Well, female and male, I should say. But it just started to get convoluted, and then the more that society around me started to talk about the separation between gender and sex, and the more I thought about femininity and masculinity versus being female and male, the less the whole thing kind of made sense to me, to be using those as metaphors. And so especially when I came back to paganism when I was a bit older, one of the first things that went was the goddess and god. I did at the very, very start, the very first circle that I cast again, and back when I was 22, I did actually incorporate the goddess and god, but almost immediately I reread Starhawk and just found that her focus was just so much more on the goddess, and then I found Bogoyan Cosmology, and she focuses entirely on the goddess and kind of just uses the feminine metaphor to describe divinity, and that just resonated with me more. It just made more sense to me, not because I wanted to get rid of the masculine, but because the binary system just wasn't working for me, and the female metaphor worked perfectly fine because of the kind of fertility aspect. Again, that's a metaphor that I've gradually let go of quite a lot as well, the very kind of gender, like the kind of very feminine focused one, but the first step for me was letting go of the god. And I'd say at this point I've largely let go of the goddess. I actually have got to the point where I refer to divinity as god, but I use feminine pronouns. So I have a sort of, I wouldn't say monotheistic because I'm such a pantheist. I don't think it could be described as monotheism, but I do like a very kind of singular understanding of divinity, and then I call it god and use feminine pronouns. Because I just want to kind of get rid of that association with divinity actually being gendered in any serious way, one way or the other. So that, to me, kind of makes divinity more mysterious and less similar to humans, I suppose, which is often what I'm looking for when I think about divinity as a whole. The second thing that I let go of was the four quarters, especially in relation to the four elements. I still was going around and calling four quarters, but I got rid of the elemental associations. And this is still something that just doesn't really make a huge amount of sense to me. I've never reincorporated that into my practice, linking the four quarters with four elements. I don't even really have four elements in my practice anymore either. And I could just never find a reason that made sense to me personally to do this. I'm totally aware that it's rooted in a history and a tradition of ceremonial magic, but that just never really resonated with me, and that kind of leads me into the second big reason why I'm not a Wiccan. And that is that essentially I don't believe in magic. So I think that when I was a teenager, I was still in a very kind of exploratory phase of life where I was still feeling around and trying to figure out what beliefs I would take with me into adulthood and figure out how I actually could see the world. And it was a totally new idea to me that actual grown-ups could believe in magic, that there were people out there who believed that they were actually affecting material change through harnessing some kind of energy. That was very new to me. I had no idea up to that point that there were actual adults out there that believed that this was real. So it was very exciting for me as a teenager in particular, because I still hadn't made up my mind about this. I hadn't decided whether it seemed real or not. And so I think, especially when I came back to spirituality in my kind of early to mid-20s, I was really thinking about magic in a very literal sense, very much about harnessing energy and using that energy to affect material, physical change. And if that wasn't happening, if I didn't think that that seemed realistic or logical, then therefore I kind of came to the conclusion like, no, I don't believe in that. I don't believe in magic. That being said, magic is not something that I've ever been able to totally let go of in relation to my practice, because there is something about the practice of witchcraft that has always been, it's always helped me get into a kind of altered state of consciousness. It's helped me move closer to that sense of kind of dark awe that I associate with mystical experience. If you've been watching me for more than about 5 or 6 years, you will have seen that I've gone through phases of trying to reincorporate witchcraft or magic into my practice, outside of just the kind of ritual aspect of it, because there's just something about it to me that is evocative. There is something about the practice of magic that resists the mundane in a way that I think no other kind of spiritual practice really does. And, you know, the more kind of guts and gore and traditional witchcraft and skulls and pentagrams and all that kind of stuff, the more of that, the better. It is, to an extent for me, I suppose, an aesthetic thing, but it runs deeper than that. It's not just about looking like a witch. I've never been interested in just looking like a witch, or even just dressing up my altar to look like a witch's altar. I've never wanted to feel like I'm play acting or kind of pretending in some way to be something that I'm not. It does run deeper than that. There is something about, you know, the times that I have been in a totally altered state of consciousness, some of the deeper times I've gotten into that kind of state during ritual has been when I'm actually working magic. And often that magic had been focused on very mundane, kind of day-to-day, daily life kind of things. I specifically remember casting a spell and creating a talisman to protect me, just for general protection in everyday life, back when I was about 16 years old. And just through going through the process of casting that spell, of sewing the bag together and doing everything, I wrote out the whole spell. I designed it myself, and I, you know, cast the circle and called the elements and called the gods and did just all of that stuff. And it just brought me to a place that I had never experienced before. And I just find that really fascinating. I find that really, really interesting. And I've never actually been able to find a way to utilize magical practices in a way that makes sense to me, in a way that I can actually use in my regular practice to get me to that point. But I definitely would be interested in doing so. So I guess that kind of brings me to the second kind of point of my video. I mean, the first kind of point was really just all the reasons why I'm not Wiccan, but this kind of fascination that I have with magic, even though I don't believe in it in a kind of I don't believe that it can affect material change. I don't believe in the kind of energetic model of magic, but I still am fascinated by it, and I still believe in its efficacy in a couple of different ways. So the first main way in which I can definitely see that magic could potentially be very powerful is in achieving inner change. And that's something that I have worked on a lot in the past. Most of the times that I have been working magic in the last kind of 8 years has been in order to affect internal personal change, and that is something that makes sense to me. It makes perfect sense to me that you can do a ritual, that you can work a spell and set yourself on a path of change, of internal personal change. I have personally changed an awful lot over the past 10 years, over the past 20 years. I have become really lots of different versions of myself and really changed fundamentally, I think, who I am. And a lot of that has been through a belief that I hold that I can actually change my habits, I can change my patterns of thought through just making certain decisions and making certain choices. And I really do very strongly believe in the power of that, in the power of changing how we exert ourselves on the world as well, and that we can really bring about big change in our lives through the subtle interactions that we have with other people and we have with our surroundings. So internal change is not just happening solely inside yourself, it can actually change things hugely on the outside as well, and especially in your interpersonal relationships. So that, to me, I can see the point of that. That to me can be very powerful. I think over time I've come to the conclusion that I don't necessarily need to work magic in order to do that. I don't need to associate it with my spirituality, and for that reason a lot of the time I end up dissociating inner work with spirituality, and I just find that, yeah, the two things for me don't have to kind of go hand in hand, and that often, I think to a large extent, that's why I've let go of magic completely out of my practice in recent years. But in another way that I have been talking for a while, for quite a long time, about how I would love to try and use magic is in order to bring about an altered state of consciousness and basically connect with divinity. So as a pantheist, connecting with divinity is it's a pretty vague kind of idea for me. It really is just about changing my state of consciousness and basically just seeing the world through a slightly different lens. That's all that I feel like I need to do in order to connect with divinity. And so it is all just about changing my state of consciousness and changing the way that I'm experiencing the world in that moment. And so when I do ritual, that is essentially what I'm aiming towards, but I can definitely see a role for something a little bit more, I guess working magic is a little bit more heavy-handed in terms of really transforming things, really transforming yourself, really transforming your environment, and really bringing in a very different energy into the circle or into the space. And I've always been fascinated with how I might achieve that, and it's something that I've never actually managed to figure out concrete ways to make that work for me. But it is something that I've toyed with in the past, and that I kind of keep coming back to again and again. So, am I a Wiccan? No, I haven't considered myself to be a Wiccan in probably about 15 years. But could I be a Wiccan? I think essentially the answer is yes. I think the biggest reason why I didn't go down that road was, I mean, the two reasons that I stated, yes, but I do think that a lot of it has to do with the fact that I have never engaged with a physical community. I have never met people in person. I have only had one ever experience of group ritual, and I've never really had the opportunity to join a coven or to try out what group practice or group magic might actually feel like. And I feel like if I'd had those experiences, that I might have ended up going down a very different road. I still think that I would have had the same kind of crisis of faith. I still think I would have felt like it was very challenging to figure out how I could continue to be a Wiccan with my changing understandings of divinity and with my changing understandings of magic. But I definitely think that if I were committed to understanding divinity through the lens of God and Goddess, that there are definitely ways in which I probably could have made that make sense for me. As I said, I actually still do have a binary understanding of divinity. I went through various kind of permutations and ended up coming up with a binary system in the end, as I said, creation and destruction. And although I associate those two aspects of reality, of divinity, mostly in a very kind of general way, just with the way that the universe operates, I also associate them with kind of lots of different individual deities as well. Like I will kind of, in my mind, separate deities roughly into the two camps. But I also do associate creativity and destruction, those two aspects of divinity, with Gaia and with the Morrigan. So I still kind of have this sort of dual, these two major deities in my life, my two major ways of seeing divinity. And I definitely think that if I was invested in for some reason in seeing divinity as God and Goddess, that I could definitely have maintained that and found ways to make it work, like I say. In terms of the four quarters and the elements, as I said, I've never come back to associating the four quarters with the four elements again, but I did come back to going and invoking the four quarters again. That is something that I did start doing in my practice. I did start sort of casting a circle again, because my initial experiences of spirituality are rooted in Wicca. Like that was the first major kind of mystical religious experience that I had, bar the kind of early experiences that I had in churches and in cathedrals. The first big experiences that I had as an autonomous human was through casting Wiccan circles. And so it makes a lot of sense to me that, you know, doing that again and going through those motions again, it gets me more consistently into the spiritual mindset, into the ritual mindset. I have definitely been thinking more over time that I would like to experiment with group work, with doing ritual in a group. It's something that I have had very, very limited experience of. And so I do often wonder what my religion, what my spirituality would look like if I'd had the opportunity to do that more, if I actually got involved with a group, if I was initiated into a coven and so on, if I had those experiences. I am quite curious as to what that would mean for me and what I could take from that and how that would change my experience. So I think going forward, I'm not saying by any means that I'm going to go out and become a Wiccan, But it has become a point of fascination for me. I've been particularly inspired to learn about it more because I've been reading and watching a lot of Thorn Mooney's content recently. I did recently also purchase her book on traditional Wicca, which I haven't read much of yet, but I'm hoping to finish in the near future. And yeah, she's always been one of my favourite pagan YouTubers and bloggers, and I find her perspective fascinating because it's so different from my own, because she is rooted in traditional Wicca, because she is a high priestess of a Wiccan coven, of a Gardnerian Wiccan coven. It's a very different world, it's a very different spiritual world to mine, but it is one that draws me in, it is one that calls to me. And so yeah, I've been feeling like I want to learn about new things, I want to push myself in new directions with my spirituality going forward, and I definitely feel like there's a lot of room for me to think more about magic and witchcraft and ceremonial magic and that kind of thing, and how I might use those tools in order to get me into that altered state of consciousness, to get me into that kind of mystical experience type place. But also I feel like it might help me get back to my roots a lot as well, and that is something that is always really valuable to me, is going back to those early roots of what first excited me about this path, what first got me going in this direction. And yeah, I've no idea where that interest, where that fascination might take me, but it is a fascination that keeps coming around again and again, the fascination with witchcraft, the fascination with Wicca, and there is something appealing about tradition, I think, to me. I think I have two kind of very different impulses when it comes to spiritual practice. There's the impulse that tells me to do everything just my own way and to be very autonomous with my spirituality and build my own rituals and have everything be personalized. But then there's the part of me that just finds a lot of magic and wonder in a tradition, in something that has been passed down through generations, in using words and symbols and patterns and so on that have been used by many, many other people, and having this kind of system to fall back on and to kind of make your own. But yeah, to kind of find the power in something that is not necessarily your own, something that is slightly other to you. And I think that there can be something very evocative in that in a very different way, because it is slightly other, because it's something that you have to learn how to do. It's something that is coming from the outside and that you're immersing yourself in. And I think that's powerful in a very different way. So I'll leave it there for now. I'd be fascinated to hear your thoughts on this. I'd love to hear what your experiences have been with Wicca. Are any of you Wiccan? Have any of you had experiences with Wicca? What has your journey looked like in relation to that specific tradition? And of course, Wicca is a very general term these days. There are a lot of different ideas about what it means. I suppose specifically I'm really talking about traditional Wicca, I suppose. But yeah, I'd love to know your thoughts. I'd love to know your backgrounds. I'd love to know what you made of this. If you are Wiccan, do you agree with things I've said, or do you totally disagree? If you have anything that you need to educate me on, absolutely do let me know. And if you have any reading suggestions, do let me know that as well. I'm going to be rereading The Triumph of the Moon in the next few weeks as well, and I'm really looking forward to that and kind of just delving back into those roots, like I say. So yeah, as always, thanks a million for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll talk to you again soon.